Hello friends, welcome back to the piano lesson. I'm Jonathan Eder, and today I'd like to talk about piano methods, different piano books and piano methods. That's a subject that we're going to be talking about from time to time, and maybe more often than not. I have an enormous collection of piano books and piano methods. I've spent decades sifting through various types of piano methodology from, I suppose the actual method books themselves probably became most popular, say, during the turn of the last century. That was sort of the time when mechanization, the Industrial Revolution, and methodology kind of became in vogue, was in fashion. And you can see a lot of different how-to books, probably in all fields, frankly, but things were trying to be explained. And in fact, there was one sort of notorious case, the great Arthur Schnabel, who, if you haven't read across his name yet, was quite the interpreter of Beethoven, piano pedagogue from Germany. And in fact, there is a whole edition, a 2-volume edition of the Beethoven sonatas that he has edited. And I had attended a class that his son Carl taught when his son Carl was pretty old at the time, and said that his father, Arthur, had some regrets about some of the things that he did in that edition as a young man. But I'm straying a bit. But when Arthur became famous, everyone wanted to know who his teacher was, and his teacher was the great Leschetizky of the Leschetizky method. And if you haven't heard of that, well, that's okay. But it's one of the many sort of piano methods that you might have run across, like we say Hanen, or in French is Hanon, or Czerny, or Pishna. I like Pishna, by the way. It's a very concise little book of scales and chords and so on. But everyone wanted to know who his teacher was, and so he said, well, it was Leschetizky. And of course, Leschetizky had to write a method book of how to become a great pianist. But when they actually asked Arthur Schnabel, well, what did you learn from Mr. Leschetizky? He said, I don't know, nothing really. So, method books, these sort of systematic approaches, can be helpful as kind of like training wheels, like riding a bicycle. They get you started, they get you going. But ultimately, you have to use your own creativity and have faith in the subconscious process that goes on in learning. So the things that you learn often it's just a framework. They're just sort of bits and pieces that help to provide a jumping off point to really explore on your own. But there's no magical piano method. I can tell you that right now. Although I will qualify that and say that I do have my own method of a sort, which is a basic method. One of the reasons I teach is because I love the basics. My attitude is I'm still a student. I'm no better or worse, but I'm no better than a beginning piano student. And I still try to keep the attitude that I'm a beginning piano student. Pride cometh before a fall, right? I mean, the moment you start to think you're all this, you have problems. And look, no matter how good you are, no matter how much you practice, no matter how much education you might have or experience, you're going to run into a situation that's going to throw you for a loop. It's going to be a little bit of a problem. And you always have to kind of have a lot of humility, especially because as pianists, we play a whole wide array of music. And I don't want to say that piano music is more difficult than anything else, but maybe it is in a lot of ways. I mean, we have 10 fingers and we have 88 keys and we have 3 pedals and there's a lot going on, okay? And we have like 400 years of piano literature and there's all different styles from all different composers. It's difficult to get into someone else's shoes, right? You may be great at playing one composer and you have difficulty playing another, and that's totally normal, right? So the process of learning, a lot of it is empathetic in some ways and structural, but we have to get into the head of someone else's ideas, right? It's someone else's composition. It's typically not our own composition. And even if it's our own composition, who's to say that we can write things that we can play? I mean, it's not uncommon for composers to write things that they can't play. In fact, a lot of composers are not performers, okay? So, you might create something that you find is beyond your technical means. It's not unusual. So there's really only 2 approaches to learning anything. I mean, I think, in my experience of 40 some odd years teaching, and that is that you can learn things by rote, mechanically, okay, but muscle memory, right? That's an important component of learning. But also conceptual learning, learning the aspect of what you're doing that isn't immediately obvious, let's say. It's not immediately in front of you. This is sort of immediately in front of me, right? I can touch it and feel it. But music is very abstract, so learning musical form, learning the structure of music, learning how scales are formed in chords and chord patterns and compositional forms, all of those things, learning how to construct a phrase. And just as a sidebar, for those folks out there that are interested in technique, I've heard that, and I kind of subscribe to this in some aspects, that there is no such thing as technique. So, and the reason I say that is because the technique is born of a musical intention. So simply practicing things mechanically, all right, is not necessarily going to be useful in the context of making music. So as soon as you can, even if you're using a method book, we've all heard these exercises, these right, these hand-in exercises, right? As soon as you can do things like that, we need to somehow reinvent them, make them musical, transpose them, phrase them differently, perhaps, not just connecting the notes, but maybe separating them, or 2-note slurs, right? Or transposing, right? Doing something the moment you get a sense of the basic pattern, right? Try to pull the rug out from under yourself. That's kind of the essence of learning jazz too. just being flexible, not being afraid to kind of fall on your face and you play wrong notes. There's nothing wrong with playing wrong notes. They're just notes, friends. Nothing's going to happen. Nothing bad's going to happen. Okay. But learning by rote or learning conceptually. Now, the advantage of teaching adults, from my perspective, is that I can teach conceptually, which is very different than if you teach a child. It's very difficult to explain a lot of things to a little kid, and they shouldn't have to have a lot of things explained. Okay, they just sit at the piano. The very first song, one of the very first songs I ever played, was called "The Seesaw." Want to hear the seesaw? I'll play it for you for a second. Here's the seesaw. Both thumbs share a middle C, and I did this. So it's C, D, E, C, B, A, C, 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 D, E, C, B, A, D, C. When I learned that with my very first piano teacher, I must have been 7 years old or something like that. I don't know. I was thrilled. I just can't tell you how thrilled I was. And I remember waking up in the morning. The sun was blazing in. It was like summertime, and I would just sort of play after looking out the window. I got beyond reading the music. I'd memorized it. That was a big deal. And I was just kind of looking around, and I was feeling so happy that I could play that. I don't know. I still like playing it. but as soon as we learn these little tunes, right, trying to reinvent ourselves a little bit and move along. So there are a number of method books. I mean, I started with I believe it was John Williams. I think that I had started with. There's and I think there's a scale book. Is it not McPherson? I'm trying to remember the name of it now. Gosh, I don't know. Someone will write me in and tell me what the name of the book was. But the advantage of having these books is also a disadvantage in the sense that now we have all these fantastic scale books and method books all printed out, and we can avail ourselves of them. But if you take them too literally, you can run into trouble. The sidebar I was going to talk about, for those folks out there, I was talking about technique. I'm jumping around a little bit. Sorry about that. So there are some basic principles that you can teach about technique, keeping in mind that all the technique is to facilitate something that's musical, right? But it's not uncommon for musicians to tie themselves up in knots physically. We're athletes too, and if we're very serious about it, we tend to sit at the piano for a long period of time. How many hours? I mean, I used to, at one point in my life, sit at the piano for 6 hours a day, 6 days a week, or something like that. And you can kind of wear out your body, And if you're young and you're sort of exploring and not as secure as you'd like, you don't really know what you're trying to achieve, and that's where you get injured. In other words, the injuries come from not having a clear idea of what you want to achieve musically. Yes, there is an aspect of understanding the biomechanics of your body, which, by the way, if I had to do it over again, I wish I had studied dance. I wish I had taken ballet. Or gymnastics or something like that, because that's something that I'm coming to relatively late in life. Although, I mean, I was blessed with having great teachers and I think, pretty decent technique, but being able to really have a clear idea of what you want to do before you do it. So rather than shooting first and asking questions later, okay, that's where the injuries come from, and that's where the frustration can come from, or the boredom, right? So again, method books, scale books, all can seem very mechanical and kind of like a bottomless pit, right, of exercises. So you focus in on certain things. You can jump around in them too, right, and find something that catches your interest that might seem to be applicable for a particular passage that you're working on. Or you can invent your own, right? You can take a piece of music and create an exercise out of that as well. And I usually find that there's two kinds of method books. There are the method books that have a lot of bits and pieces of ideas, conceptual things, but they never flesh them out. They never really systematically hash them out. It's a lot of work and it's not so easy. A book that comes to mind, again, it's not a criticism, okay? It really isn't. But a book that comes to mind, I believe, is Mark Levine's The Piano Book. I think it's called The Piano Book. And it's about jazz, learning jazz. And if you flip through it, it has bits and pieces of different styles of playing jazz, but I don't think there's more than a page or two of examples, right? And then he goes on to the next thing. And I've had a lot of people come to me with that book, and it really requires someone with experience. Now, if you have experience, right, you can take that kernel of an idea and then you can run with it, right? But that's hard to do, okay? The other books, I find, are completely devoid of music, right? And they're just complete, mechanistic approaches, okay? And sometimes they're a balancing act. So the Alfred books tend to be kind of a balancing act with that, although they're, again, a bit old-fashioned, let's say, and, mechanical, mechanistic. They're not bad, but as soon as you can get on your feet, as soon as you can form some kind of connection with the keyboard, it's really great to start learning music theory. All right. So what is music theory? Well, music theory is simply a language that we've created to describe another language, which is music. So it's an intellectual language to describe a musical language, and in the hopes of better wrapping our brains around it, understanding it because it's abstract, and raising the likelihood that we can play music more reliably and more to our satisfaction. So we're not just guessing, okay? And there's a lot of patterns in music. Why is there a lot of patterns in music? Is because someone made patterns? No, they're a direct reflection of where music comes from, which is nature, right? Music comes from the fabric of the universe, right? You can look at it in terms of physics, right? It's vibrations, but these are things that you can study. I'm not going to go into them at the moment. But the overtone series, which in some ways is analogous to, let's say, the refraction of light in a rainbow, right? Whereby a rainbow is in fact white light that has been refracted or bent, right? And the colors that we see are consistent, right, from the beginning of time to the end of time throughout the world. And sound behaves in the same way, although we don't see sound, hopefully, right, unless you have synesthesia or you're eating mushrooms or something. But although, some people, in fairness, some people actually think of music in terms of colors. And we use the word color to describe music in some ways. The word is timbre. It's spelled Timbre, but it's pronounced timbre. Tone color, like the difference between the sound of a woodwind instrument, like say an oboe, and a brass instrument, like a trumpet. They can both play the same musical passage and have a different. The word is color. So that's one area where we use the word color in music. But something that might be more colorful could be something that has more chromaticism in it, potentially. Notes that are not in the key, right? So that's another area. Some adds more dissonance, could be another word for color. But the idea that you have those two categories, right? You have those. When you pick up a book, typically you're going to fall into one of those two camps. Or if it's just a composition, right? It's just a piece of music, like a piece of Beethoven, or a piece of Mozart, or a piece of Gershwin, or I don't know. You're looking at a musical score that has been notated by the composer or an arranger, right? So the difference being that if the music that we're looking at with Bach or Beethoven, that's the notation that the composer wrote note for note. Whereas, pardon me, if there's a recording, say on YouTube, very often the composers may not write music, may not know how to write music, pardon me. And so they hire someone to transcribe it, flesh it out a bit, make it work on the piano. That's called arranging. Very often that doesn't work really well. Most of the things we hear aren't particularly pianistic, and so they don't often lay well on the piano. And not to get in the weeds too much, but if you're learning a piece of music, like a classical piece of music, certain publishers of that music may be more advantageous than others to use. For instance, in general, you have two categories of published works. You have the ones that are edited and the ones that are unedited. So the ones that are unedited are usually referred to as urtext, okay? And those are supposed to be precisely what the composer wrote on the paper, with no additions at all, which is a tricky bit of business to do, to be able to decide on, because usually it isn't quite that cut and dried, but that's what it's supposed to be. And that's very useful to have, but also problematic to learn from, particularly if you're learning Bach, because in Bach's music there were no phrase marks, and you have to kind of know a little bit about music in order to play it and interpret it properly. Or there are edited works, taking like Busoni, who is a noted pianist, and also he edited Bach's works. So a lot of the books that are published by Schirmer were quite good. If you're doing Chopin, for instance, some of the, I believe the Macaulay editions are preferable to look at if you're learning Chopin. You're learning Beethoven, probably people still want to look at the Schnabel editions, although you have to take those with a grain of salt. But there are edited and unedited versions of those books too. So there's a lot to consider. You know, I remember as a kid, I'm starting to do that now. But I do remember as a kid, I remember sheet music stores. Do you remember sheet music stores? I remember sheet music stores. They were my favorite place to go, and particularly actually in Portland. I loved going to sheet music stores. Portland had some of the best, and there was one in particular called Sheet Music Service of Portland, and it was this enormous building with 2 tiers, and it was like going to the library, really. And the people who worked there were fantastic. They were really knowledgeable, and you would think it wouldn't be that difficult to just get a piece of sheet music, but it's complicated. It can be like going to the hardware store, you know, and there's like more than one option, more than one screwdriver to get, right? It was or maybe a better analogy might be going to a pharmacist, you know, and the pharmacist looks at your prescription and he says, oh, well, do you want the name brand or the generic, or do you want this or that? So I'd go to the sheet music store, and this older guy would come out, and he'd like, oh, okay, well, what do you want? And, oh, you're playing Bach. All right, well, you know, do you want the Urtext, or do you want this edition or that? And he'd bring a bunch out, and he'd kind of coach you and tell you about the books, and who knew, you know? And it did make a big difference. And just as a sidebar, a lot of publishers kind of stole from one another. You know, they stole the plates. I forget, I think it was Calmus. Was it Calmus that stole from who? I don't remember which other publisher, but there was a lot of fighting among publishers. By the way, another bit of fun fact, if you look at some of the Beethoven editions, Beethoven sonatas, one of the publishers of the Beethoven sonatas was also an Eder. I don't know if he was my relative or not. I think it was Joseph Eder, but apparently Eder is a German name, and there's a river Eder in Germany, but I've always kind of wondered. If anyone knows, if anyone wants to do some genealogical research on that, let me know. I'd be very curious to know. That'd be kind of fun. Not to say that the publisher was necessarily a great musician, but whatever. So there's a lot to know in method books, but the thing is, don't bet the farm on them. You know, they're not magic, okay? I have a course that I put together simply because I couldn't find anything else like it. I don't know why I couldn't. It was a very simple idea, probably the most simple idea there is on the face of the earth regarding music. It's a collection of 100 songs that's based on one important pattern, the most important pattern in music, the pattern of primary chords. And so it's a collection of those songs. And I put them together because I'm a little lazy, and you want the path of least resistance for people. So I wanted something that would play itself, really, that almost like the difference between the old DOS computers and the Mac computers, right? You want something that you don't need an instruction manual per se. You just sit down and you just start playing. A, because the tunes are familiar to you, and B, because the underlying pattern is the same, and in the hopes that not only would you learn all these songs, you'd learn all the 100 songs, and a whole variety of songs, by the way. You know, it could be classical music and folk music and music from the Civil War and nursery rhymes and Christmas music, right? But you'd also come to appreciate the underlying structure of the music, that it's all based on one simple pattern. It's a very simple idea. It's not so easy to wrap your head around. And it's nothing that I can really convince anyone of in one meeting. I could explain it all to them, but they won't really understand or appreciate it until they've gone through it. And sometimes they go through it and they still don't understand it. But most do, actually. Most do by the end. And then they have a running start. Then they can jump off into other things. And actually, again, another sidebar, but another interesting aspect of having these little tunes is that they are really a window into the past. It's like a time machine in a sense. If you play a Civil War song, you really get a sense of, wow, that's what they were thinking at the time. That's what they were feeling. That's what they felt like, And then now with the internet, you go online, you type in a title, and by the way, I am a Wikipedia fan. I like Wikipedia, all right? And I typically think it's pretty good. But Wikipedia comes up, and you get the history of this song and what part of the world it's from and when it was written. And you learn all kinds of interesting things that you never would have known before. So the music is actually a jumping off point to learn all these other things. As opposed to, by the way, an auxiliary add-on, right? Like you always hear people saying, well, music will help your math, or we should learn music to help our science, or we should learn music to learn music. Okay, we don't need another reason to learn music, and there are multitudes in music anyway. We don't need to debase music education by making it play second fiddle, no pun intended, to another subject. Right? That's like really the wrong way to look at it. That's my little information about my course, so that it would provide a core, right? A core of understanding music. A cup of coffee, a keyboard, and you. There was a song many years ago. I think it was an Irving Berlin song, but it was a cup of coffee, a sandwich, and you. That was a great song. So it's kind of where I got the idea from. I'm sure you all know who I'm talking about, Irving Berlin. And no, I don't think so. I love Irving Berlin. Go look it up. Well, you might know Irving Berlin. So part of my plan is to probably go through some of these methods and share with you the ones that I think were great, really interesting, and others that I think that are useful for certain things, and others that probably are best avoided. And since we don't have sheet music stores anymore, and we don't have people to help us. Ooh, that was a lot of stuff. Okay, well, please write me at thepianolesson.com and let me know what your thoughts are. This is Jonathan Eder, and we'll see you next time. Till then, adios, muchachos.